The last message I sent before my professional world at Aegis Analytics completely unraveled was a simple pull request comment that read, "Please review the updated fraud trigger logic. It finally catches synthetic internet protocol trails without overfitting, and it should reduce false positives by 13%. The next morning, that pull request was gone, and so was the entire repository. I noticed it while eating stale pretzels in the break room, scrolling through my notifications like I always did when avoiding Trent from sales, who smelled like cheap body spray and tax evasion. I refreshed the page 3 times, but there was nothing. No fork, no archive, just a 404 error page staring back at me as if my 3 years of hard labor had never existed. I checked my command line interface, ran a git status, and attempted to pull from the remote server, but the console only returned a message stating that the repository could not be found or did not exist. It was as if my entire history with the project had been swept away by some invisible hand. Then came the email. There was no greeting, no sign-off, just a cold subject line regarding the predictive risk engine. Evelyn Finch, our human resources director who was known for gutting departments with a polite smile, had written, "For transparency, the predictive risk engine project has been reassigned to Toby Miller for his summer rotation. Please provide a knowledge transfer document by the end of the day." I stared at the text on my screen, watching the cursor blink in the quiet room. I laughed so loud a junior developer nearby dropped her sparkling water. Toby Miller was the same intern who had once asked if the back-end database was the place where the emails go. He was the nephew of one of our executive board members, a young man whose entire technical contribution last sprint was changing a button color to Bitcoin blue and breaking half the cascading style sheets in dark mode. They did not even have the decency to call it a demotion. They called it a learning opportunity for cross-functional growth. In corporate speak, that translated to, "You built something incredibly valuable, so we are going to hand it to a golden retriever in a startup hoodie so he can take the credit." But here is the one crucial detail they forgot. I did not build that engine in isolation. I built it like a vault, and I had left behind just enough scaffolding to watch whoever tried to climb it fall screaming. I went home early that afternoon, opened my local clone, poured myself a flat soda, and did what any senior engineer with a bruised ego and full system access would do. I started writing a migration script, not to transfer ownership, but to reclaim it. I was 48 years old, and I had spent 2 decades in this industry learning that loyalty is a one-way street. I had built the predictive risk engine, which I called Stingray, to be a masterpiece. But before I ran any script, I made a secure backup. I backed up every Slack message, every merge timestamp, and a very specific commit hash that referenced something nobody else had noticed yet. Especially not Toby. It was Sunday at 1:15 in the morning. The house was dead quiet except for my radiator wheezing like it owed me rent. The glow from my third monitor lit up my living room like a crime scene, and in a way, it was. I was not just migrating code. I was performing an autopsy on my own creation. Line by line, commit by commit, I traced the digital fingerprints I had left behind. I was looking for proof. They thought the engine was just a simple plug-and-play fraud filter. They thought they could drop in an intern, slap on some agile stickers, and call it scalable. But they did not know what I had buried in it. It was not malicious code, because I am not an idiot, but it was proprietary logic. I had drafted this engine outside of work hours, designed it on my personal machine, and modeled it using my private sandbox datasets that their servers had never touched. The math that made the engine smart was mine, and thanks to my habit of backing up everything, I had the versioned receipts. I spent those quiet hours checking every link and directory on my local drive. I had documented the hours spent on my personal laptop, matching them against my company timesheets to prove that not a single line of the core analytics was written during working hours. I had saved the local Git history, which clearly showed the origin branch was created on my own workstation, weeks before the project was even proposed at Aegis Analytics. I compiled these files into an encrypted folder. I knew that my manager, Peter Higgins, and the HR director, Evelyn Finch, were plotting to present this work to the board as a triumph of their new intern program. They wanted a success story to justify their hiring choices, and my work was the perfect sacrifice. I had brewed a fresh pot of dark roast coffee, hoping it would help me focus, but it did not help ease the sense of dread that was growing in my chest. The break room was unusually bright, the morning sun streaming through the large windows, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. I sat there for several minutes, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the quiet chatter of the reception staff down the hall, feeling completely disconnected from the corporate machine that I had helped build. I was about to show them that a 48-year-old software engineer does not go quietly into the night. The commit hash from Friday, which everyone had ignored, referenced a module titled Stingray Beta version 4. Stingray was not part of the official corporate architecture. It was a silent observer, a behavior profiler that did not just flag suspicious logins, but learned user drift over time. It analyzed how real customers typo their passwords at 4 in the morning, or how organized fraud rings simulate human randomness but never quite nail it. It was machine learning duct taped to human intuition, and it worked better than anything the company had ever purchased. It tracked keystroke dynamics, mouse trajectory tracking, browser window focus shifts, and session duration to form a multidimensional signature of human behavior. I realized this timing-based profiling would be highly valuable in financial transactions, and I spent months perfecting it on my personal time. I spent many late nights adjusting the learning rates, optimizing the random forest trees, and pruning the neural network nodes to ensure that the detection accuracy remained high even with minimal system resource usage. This level of optimization was unheard of in the company's existing products, which relied on heavy database calls that slowed down server response times during peak hours. By running these optimizations locally, I kept the system lightweight and efficient. I spent hours writing custom database queries that would allow the engine to query the pattern log without locking the main tables. In our production database, every millisecond of latency could result in lost revenue, so I had designed the query path to use a fast, read-only cache. I tested this system under simulated loads of 10,000 concurrent requests, and it handled the traffic without a single error. It was a level of technical performance that Toby could not even begin to conceptualize, let alone implement. When Toby imported the repository on Sunday morning, because my automated webhook pinged me the second he did, he inherited the shell. But the guts of the system were already gone. I had scrubbed them clean. Instead of the behavior matrix, the module now printed a dummy return that read, "All good." It was simple, and it was devastating. I had replaced the actual machine learning library imports with mock classes that simply returned success values without performing any data analysis. At 9:20 at night, I pushed the real logic to a private repository titled Stingray Requiem. It included the full code, a detailed architecture breakdown, annotated commits, and a presentation slide deck labeled for executive eyes only. I timestamped everything, locked it behind biometric two-factor authentication, and smiled. I knew what was coming. I knew that under United States copyright law, Title 17, United States Code, Section 106, I held the exclusive rights to this work. Since I had created it entirely outside my scope of employment, on my own computer, and without using a single company asset, it did not constitute a work made for hire under Section 201, subsection B. I had scrutinized the research and development clause in my initial employment contract with Aegis Analytics, verifying that any work created on personal equipment without company funding remained my personal property. I felt a wave of relief when I found the specific exclusion clause, which meant they had zero legal claim to my algorithms. If they tried to deploy it or claim it as theirs, they would be committing federal copyright infringement. Monday morning was the sprint review, and they were walking in blind, holding a bomb they thought was a flashlight. The meeting started with the usual corporate pageantry. There were fake smiles, stale bagels, and Toby grinning like a child who had colored inside the lines for the first time. Our manager, Peter Higgins, was the kind of manager who had never written a single line of production code in his life. Yet he spoke with absolute authority on software architecture. He had spent his entire career in meetings, compiling spreadsheets, and repeating whatever buzzwords he had read in technology blogs that morning. His reliance on Toby was a desperate attempt to show that his hiring strategy was successful. Peter Higgins kicked things off in his typical presentation voice, stating that Toby was going to walk us through the exciting upgrades with fresh eyes and agile momentum. I muted my microphone and watched. Toby clicked through the slide deck I had bled over, which he had replaced with colorful icons and meaningless phrases about next-generation fraud synergy. Then he tabbed into the code window. I watched his cursor hover on the screen, then freeze, then backtrack. He scrolled up, then down, then up again. His voice cracked slightly as he said, "So this is the core fraud logic we are using. I refactored some of the legacy variables and streamlined the return values." He called my logic legacy, as if he had inherited an attic full of broken record players instead of a fully functional machine learning module that had flagged $4,500,000 in synthetic churn last quarter. Then he clicked to run the test suite. The terminal spat out one lonely line of text that read, "All good." There was silence. It was the kind of silence that smells like smoke and impending litigation. I sat in my home office, watching the faces on the video grid. Peter Higgins was squinting at his monitor, trying to locate the complex data visualization charts that usually appeared during my presentations. Toby was sweating, his fingers tapping nervously against his keyboard as he tried to figure out why the entire behavior matrix module was returning nothing but empty values. The other developers in the call remained silent, sensing that something was terribly wrong but unwilling to speak up. I kept my hand hover over the unmute button, letting the tension build in the channel until the silence became unbearable. This was the moment where they realized their perfect intern project was nothing but an empty box. Peter Higgins squinted at the screen. "Wait, Toby, where is the behavior matrix? Where is the anomaly classifier? Julian, did the original repository not include those?" I unmuted my microphone, keeping my voice calm and sweet. "Oh, it did," I said, "but I assumed Toby did not need it, since he has fresh eyes and agile momentum." Toby's face turned so red I thought his webcam might melt. He started stammering about version mismatches and strange conflicts during the import process. He struggled to explain how the data pipeline routes user sessions to the machine learning models, and he stutters when asking Peter for assistance. Peter Higgins tried to cover for him, stating that Toby had optimized the codebase by removing legacy complexities to make it more streamlined. I watched the other developers on the call start to turn their video feeds off, a silent sign of corporate discomfort. They knew as well as I did that Toby was out of his depth and that Higgins was trying to save his own reputation by forcing an unqualified relative into a critical engineering role. The tension in the virtual room was palpable, and I could hear the quick, shallow breathing of Toby through his unmuted microphone, as he realized he could not answer Richard's technical questions. I decided it was time to drop the hammer. "Perhaps you should check the commit hash ending in FFACE, I suggested. It was the last clean version, before the Stingray module was extracted, though I doubt Toby has access to it. That logic is my private intellectual property, not company property. I worked on it during my off hours on my personal machine, and under Title 17 United States Code, Section 106, I own the copyright. I explained that the commits ending in FACE were all signed with my private key, which is associated with my personal email address, not my company credentials. I pointed out that the creation dates of these commits predated my involvement with the predictive risk engine project at Aegis Analytics." Richard sat in silence, nodding slowly as the legal and technical reality of the situation began to settle in. He knew that the company had no claim to my work. The silence returned, heavier this time. Then a voice broke through the quiet. It was Richard, our chief technology officer, who was not even scheduled to be in this call. Richard asked, "If the anomaly classifier is gone, how are we supposed to pass the upcoming security audit next month? The board is expecting the new engine to secure our system. Julian, did you document this development separation?" I leaned forward and adjusted my microphone volume. "Yes, Richard," I replied. "The timestamped commits, the external repository, the encrypted logs, and the presentation draft are already in your inbox under the title Stingray Requiem." I clicked the button to leave the call. 35 minutes later, the sprint review was still going on without a single slide progressing. I had detonated a truth in the middle of their meeting, and they were choking on the fallout. I did not do any more work that day. Instead, I warmed up some food, turned off my messaging notifications, and watched the traffic graph on my private repository spike. Someone, or rather multiple people, were crawling through every commit and footnote like bloodhounds. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Richard had emailed me twice. The first email was polite, asking to connect about the Stingray work. The second email was nervous, mentioning that they needed to clarify intellectual property boundaries and that legal had some questions. I did not respond. I wanted them to marinate in their confusion. At 2:45 in the afternoon, someone tried to log into my private repository using an old staging credential. I received the alert immediately. The Internet Protocol trace pointed directly to our corporate network. Nice try, Peter. That night, I opened my professional network account and found my inbox full of messages. Recruiters and managers from rival firms were reaching out, but I did not answer. The other engineering leads in our company chat started posting private messages to me, saying, "Did they really try to steal your project for the board intern? And you absolute legend, you walked out on them." Tuesday morning, my security badge still scanned green, but the receptionist would not meet my eyes. The office was filled with the smell of panic and nervous energy. Everyone suddenly had deep focus blocks on their calendars the moment I walked past. Toby's desk was completely empty. His laptop was gone, and he had not been seen on our chat application since 2:10 in the morning, when he sent a single message to the developer channel saying, "I think I messed up. Sorry." There was no emoji. That was how we knew it was serious. I walked to the break room to get my morning coffee, and the silence followed me there. Two developers from the data team were talking in hushed tones, but they immediately stopped when I entered. I poured my coffee, offered them a polite nod, and walked back to my desk. I stood up from my desk, walked to the window, and looked out at the street below. The air in my office was warm, and the sound of traffic was a welcome distraction from the silent chaos I had left behind in the virtual meeting room. I felt a profound sense of relief, as if a weight that I had been carrying for 3 years had suddenly been lifted from my shoulders. I knew that they were running emergency diagnostic scripts, trying to rebuild the fraud logic from scratch. But they would soon discover that without my proprietary mathematical models, the database would only flag legitimate customers and let actual fraud rings slip through. They were losing money by the hour, and their upcoming quarterly security audit was looming. My inbox was a collection of urgent meeting requests, but the one that stood out was from Anita Finch, the internal counsel for data and privacy. She was known as a brilliant, surgical legal mind who rarely got involved unless the company faced an existential threat. The subject line read, "Urgent Privileged Legal and Intellectual Property Conversation." The email invited me to a meeting at 2:15 in the afternoon with the legal team and a representative from the executive board to resolve the confusion surrounding Stingray. I clicked yes, and then I opened the folder on my desktop labeled Leverage. It contained 3 critical files. First was a screen recording of Toby fumbling through the repository, proving he did not understand the architecture. Second was a Slack message from Evelyn Finch dated April 5th, explicitly telling me to work on Stingray during my off hours if I wanted to pursue it. Third was an accidental audio recording of a hallway conversation where Peter Higgins could be heard saying, "Just give it to the intern. Julian is too attached. If he quits, he quits. We already have the code." They did not have the code. They had an empty shell, and they were about to realize it. At 2:15 in the afternoon, I joined the video call. Anita looked exhausted. A board member was also there, trying to look casual but failing. They tried to smile, but I remained expressionless. Anita's tone was measured and professional, but there was a clear undercurrent of urgency in her questions. She asked about the exact scope of the code, whether any company servers were used during its compilation, and if I had signed any intellectual property waivers. I answered each question calmly, referencing the document numbers and timesheets in my audit folder. The board member looked increasingly uncomfortable, whispering to someone off camera. Anita began by saying they wanted to reach an understanding about where Stingray fits within the company parameters. I nodded, shared my screen, and played the files. I showed the documentation, the time cards, the Slack messages, and finally, the audio recording. I played the hallway conversation where Peter Higgins chuckled about how older engineers are too possessive of their code and how they can easily hire younger grads to replace them. By the second minute, the board members stopped slouching. By the fourth minute, Anita's professional composure had vanished. I presented the side-by-side comparison of my Git logs and timesheets. Evelyn Finch tried to argue that because the project was integrated into Aegis Analytics repository, the company held implicit rights. Anita Finch cut her off immediately, saying, "Evelyn, the Git history shows the source code was imported from a pre-existing private repository developed on a personal machine, and your own Slack message tells Julian to do it. Off hours, we have zero legal standing." I also knew that the company had recently signed a major funding agreement that was contingent on their ownership of all core platform technology. A dispute over the intellectual property of their primary fraud engine would halt their funding and trigger an immediate audit by the executive board. This was my ultimate leverage, and I was fully prepared to use it to protect my career and my hard work from their corporate overreach. When the recordings finished, I looked directly into the camera. "I have no interest in lawsuits," I said, "but I have every intention of owning what I built. Here is what is going to happen. You will update the project attribution, you will issue an internal correction, and Evelyn Finch will apologize to me in writing." Evelyn joined the call late, looking flustered. She started to speak, clearing her throat, saying, "Julian, I think there has been a miscommunication. We deeply value your innovation." I cut her off. "You do not need to value my innovation," I said. "You just need to admit what you did. You tried to pass off my private research as company property and reassign my project to an intern with zero experience." Say it. A full 7 seconds of silence passed. I could see the panic in her eyes. Then, her voice cracked as she said, "I tried to take credit for something that was not mine. I am sorry." Evelyn's apology was barely audible over the microphone, and she looked down at her desk as she spoke. She had spent years treating employees as replaceable resources, using her position to manipulate and control. But now she was the one who was powerless. Her career at the company was effectively over, and she knew it. I let that apology hang in the air before delivering my final terms. "I have drafted an article detailing this entire incident, and whether I publish it depends on your next actions. I want retroactive credit, a public correction in the engineering channel, a guaranteed severance package, and Evelyn's name removed from my project." Anita unmuted her microphone and said, "I think those terms are reasonable." The board member nodded in agreement. I left the call without another word. I shut down my computer for the day and sat in the quiet of my office. I knew they would spend the next few hours scrambling to draft the correction and finalize the severance package. They had no other option. If I published my article, it would expose their toxic work environment and their attempt to steal an employee's private intellectual property. It would destroy their reputation, panic their investors, and result in a federal copyright lawsuit they could not win. They had tried to treat me as an aging, replaceable asset, but they had learned that my 20 years of experience had given me the wisdom to protect my work. 45 minutes later, an email from legal arrived with a signed agreement. Evelyn's name was nowhere on it. The next morning at 9:30, an internal announcement went live in the main engineering channel. It was a polite but precise correction, outlining the development history of the Stingray module, confirming my sole authorship, and noting that future developments would follow my architectural vision. There was no mention of Toby or Evelyn, but every engineer in the company could read between the lines. The reactions flooded in, including a single knife emoji from a colleague in finance. By noon, Toby emailed me from his personal address. His message was surprisingly honest. He claimed he did not know they were handing him my work, and that Peter Higgins had made it sound like simple maintenance. He apologized for panicking and not speaking up. I did not reply, not out of malice, but because there was nothing left to say. I had already moved the repository again. I'd uploaded Stingray to a private, invite-only platform backed by a fraud technology startup in Zurich named Vortex Fraud Systems. Through a contact, I negotiated a deal for silent equity and a $35,000 consulting onboarding bonus. The Zurich startup Vortex Fraud Systems was founded by two former security researchers who had worked at a major European bank. They immediately recognized the value of timing-based keystroke profiling and session dynamics. The Swiss founders plan to integrate the Stingray technology into their upcoming transaction security platform, which would be deployed across several major European banking systems. They recognized that timing-based behavior dynamics represented the future of digital security, and they were willing to pay a premium for my expertise. I agreed to serve as a technical advisor, which would allow me to work remotely from my home office on my own schedule. The $35,000 consulting bonus was wired directly to my account, providing a comfortable financial cushion as I transitioned out of Aegis Analytics. The agreement was structured to ensure that I remained the primary technology advisor for their platform. The silent equity stake was legally registered in my name through their Swiss legal representatives, representing a 10% stake in their pre-market entity, securing my long-term financial interest in their growth. The trademark registration for Stingray meant that Aegis Analytics was forced to rename their entire risk architecture to avoid a costly trademark dispute, which further embarrassed Peter Higgins and the remaining management team. The severance package was deposited into my account by the end of the week, representing 6 months of salary and full benefits. It was a generous settlement, but it was a small price for the company to pay to avoid a federal copyright lawsuit and the public embarrassment of a major intellectual property dispute. The correction in the engineering channel remained pinned for several days, serving as a silent warning to everyone in the company. I checked Evelyn's profile that evening and saw it had been updated to show she was exploring new opportunities. Her career at the company had collapsed. I smiled, realizing that sometimes silence is the loudest warning you can give. On Friday at 10:30 in the morning, exactly 1 week after the project was stolen, I walked into the office one last time. I was not there to negotiate. I was there to retrieve my plants and my favorite coffee mug. The room went quiet as I walked through the engineering floor. Toby was sitting at a temporary desk, looking defeated, and he mouthed the word thanks as I passed. Evelyn's office was already empty, her nameplate removed. On my way to the elevator, Peter Higgins caught up with me. His smile was strained, and his voice trembled. "Julian, no hard feelings, right?" I let the silence stretch for several seconds before replying. "No hard feelings, Peter," I said. "But you should know your new fraud architecture is still using 2 of my legacy endpoints, and one of them leaks data to an abandoned server." His face turned pale. I stepped into the elevator, and as the doors began to close, I added, "And do not worry, I documented that too." By noon, I was sitting in a cafe downtown, drinking coffee and watching the metrics for the Zurich startup tick upward. I had built the technology, protected my rights, and walked away with my reputation intact. I opened my laptop to check the new company registration documents. The Swiss startup had already finalized the transfer of my silent equity shares. They had also invited me to present at the Global Summit on AI Integrity next year, where I would discuss the balance between developer rights and corporate ownership. It was a fitting conclusion to a stressful week. I closed the screen and looked out the window. The city was busy, but for the first time in 3 years, I felt completely at peace. I had proved that experience and foresight will always triumph over corporate greed and nepotism. As I sat in the cafe, I watched the notifications on my phone. A few former colleagues had sent messages asking to meet for coffee, eager to hear the full story of how I had reclaimed my code and forced an HR director to resign. I did not reply immediately, choosing to enjoy the silence and the clear morning sky. I had spent 20 years in this industry fighting corporate battles, and this was the first time I had won on my own terms. The future was open, and for the first time in a very long time, I was the one who controlled my own destination. I smiled, closed my laptop, and took a sip of my coffee.